Hey, welcome to Candid Conversation number 591. We're on 1 Corinthians 9 today. Our verse is 1 Corinthians 9:18. What is my reward then? Verily that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge. That I abuse not my power in the gospel. Hard to read my own writing. So that's 1 Corinthians 9:18. And I think it's an important verse for us to understand, because today in the dispensation of grace, you've got a lot of churches and churchianity out there, and everybody takes a salary. You know, I think it's interesting that they'll say, oh, we got to follow the red letters of Jesus, and, make sure we follow Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But yet they bring in Malachi 3:10. I didn't think you follow the Old Testament, but yet tithing is a very Old Testament concept. I realize that Israel, they have that in their program in the New Testament as well, but you don't really hear it talked about there, because as a nation, they're not ruling themselves anymore. They're under the Roman rule there when you get to the New Testament. And so tithing was started. It's a way to help out the Levites, who were the priestly tribe, and they had a lot of expenses related to that. And tithing isn't like today where you just give to a church voluntarily. Tithing was a requirement, and it was like a tax, if you want to call it that. It was the way to support the government that God established, the Levitical priesthood. And tithing wasn't giving money, it was giving food to help out the Levites. I know when you have these people that stand on corners saying, we'll work for food, you try to give them some food, they don't want it. They want money, because they're not really looking for food, they're looking to buy drugs or alcohol. Well, churchianity, they don't want your food, they want money, so that they can buy with the money what they want. And and I think that's why God had the tithing for it to be food. Bring ye all, Malachi 3:10, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in my house. So anyway, this isn't a thing about tithing, but I just mention it because that's churchianity is all about getting your money. And here's Paul. Now Paul says in the verse before this, 1 Corinthians 9:17, he says, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. He was the apostle of the Gentiles. God called 12 apostles for Israel's program there at the Ed-hand face of the kingdom. But he only called one apostle, the apostle Paul, to be the apostle of the Gentiles, to give the mystery gospel to the entire world. I realize there are others who helped, other apostles in the dispensation of grace. According to Ephesians 4, he did give apostles to the body of Christ. But Paul, a dispensation of the gospel was committed specifically to Paul. The mystery was given to him. He calls it my gospel. My point is, if anybody had the right to take money from the churches he went to, it would be Paul. I mean, you talk about having some expenses. He's got to go over the entire world and preach the gospel. That was his commission, not just go to Israel and not have 11 other people helping you out, but he is the apostle of the Gentiles, going to the whole world himself. Granted, Barnabas came with him, Silas, John Mark, he had other people, but Luke, should say, not Mark. Mark went with Barnabas, but Luke went with Paul. So he had other people going with him, but primarily it was up to Paul. And you got a lot more expenses when you're traveling the whole world to preach the gospel than you do if you are just staying at a church like what pastors do. So if anybody has the right to ask for money to help himself out, and he even quotes in 1 Corinthians 9, before we get to these verses, he even quotes the passage in Deuteronomy, thou shalt not muzzle the ox which treadeth out the corn. comparing himself to an ox, that even the ox, a beast of burden, gets food to support it. So it seems like then, at least the churches that Paul goes to would support him with food. But yet, he says here in 1 Corinthians 9:18, what is my reward then? Verily, that when I preach the gospel, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. You may say, well, Paul, you have every right to get money from the people. That's what churchianity says. But here he says, well, I am not going to. I'm going to make it without charge if possible. Here he is traveling all over the world giving the gospel, and yet he, when he should be sleeping, is instead a tent maker, making tents so that he can make a little money, so that he can pay his own way when he travels around the world. Why? Because he doesn't want to abuse his power in the gospel. And again, it was not that he would abuse it. It's not that he would take more money than he should. Paul's not going to build a mansion, but the temptation is there for that. It's interesting that Jesus, when there was money coming into him, money to support the apostles, the 12 disciples, and him traveling around and eat and different things, and yet he gave the money. He had 12 apostles. He knew that one of them, Judas Iscariot, was a traitor, that he was an unbeliever. The other 11 are believers, and yet he gives the managing of the money to the traitor, to the unbeliever. He knows that Judas is stealing the money, and yet he gives it to him anyway, because he doesn't want to be tempted with money. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, the love of money is the root of all evil. Nothing wrong with money. It's the love of money that is the problem. And if you don't have it, then it's hard to love it. Hard to love something you don't have. And so Jesus, so that he's not tempted, just lets the money be handled by a thief who's going to steal it. And that way he doesn't have to worry about it. Usually you think, oh, that's the opposite. I'm going to worry about it because the thief is going to steal it. But Jesus says the money isn't important, so I'll let the thief take it. Paul, he doesn't ask money from people, because if he starts getting a whole bunch of money for being the apostle of the Gentiles, he may start loving money. And also, when he says he's committed to preach the gospel, he does it without charge. The reason that he does it without charge is so that people can't use money as an excuse not to believe the gospel. Because today, a lot of times, people reject churchianity because they see these televangelists, these preachers with these big mansions and making millions of dollars. And so then they'll use that as an excuse, saying, oh, well, that's not the truth. That's just a money-making scheme. Why should I believe those shysters out there who make millions of dollars? I'm not going to, but that's not the truth. The money, it's not going to be the truth if they do it for money. And that, that's a good point. So Paul, even though he says, I'm not going to take any of your money, Corinthians. He says, I may make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. And so it's important to understand. Again, a few verses before, he quotes Deuteronomy and says that he deserves some of their money, because thou shalt not muzzle the ox which treadeth out the corn. And so it's, it would be right for them to give them money. But Paul later on in 1 Corinthians 9 says, to the Jew I became a Jew, that I might save the Jews. He says, I become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. Paul's commission wasn't to make a good life living and as a side job preach the Bible. Paul's commission was to be an ambassador for Christ, to preach the gospel all over the world to people who hadn't heard it, and then giving the sound doctrine for this dispensation to those who were saved. And that was his primary goal, and he didn't want anything to hinder him. When he went to get the Jews, try to get the Jews saved, he went to Jerusalem. He had a Nazirite vow, and he took a couple of Jews who were also under the Nazirite vow into the temple. Now, the Nazirite vow is for Israel's program. He did not have to do that. But yet he did it so that he would have an audience with the Jews, so that they would look at him and say, wow, he's really a devout servant of Jehovah God, because he has separated himself as a Nazirite. And so he does this on purpose. He takes a vow that he doesn't have to take, the Nazirite vow, in hopes that the Jews may be saved. So too when it comes to money. Thou shalt not muzzle the ox who treadeth out the corn. So Paul, as a servant of Christ, going all over the world preaching the gospel, deserves to be supported by those he is serving, just like the ox deserves to have food from the one he is treading out the corn for. But yet Paul says, my goal is to make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. He says, the more I get money from people, the more I may love money. That's number one. And number two is, people can't use money as an excuse for not believing the gospel. When it says the love of money is the root of all evil there in 1 Timothy 6:10, it says, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So it doesn't take much, to go into sin. And so if he's got a lot of money coming in, it'd be very easy for him to start loving the money. And if he loves the money, well, then he's going to err from the faith, because Satan is the god of this world. And so you can't serve God and also money. That's what Jesus said. He said, you cannot serve God and mammon, mammon being the god of money. So you're either going to love one and hate the other. And so if you love God and don't love mammon or love money, then you can preach the gospel and people, that will be your primary goal and people be saved. But if you love money, then you're not loving God, and so then you're going to err from the faith and pierce yourself through with many sorrows. So just like Jesus says, Judas, you handle the money, you be the treasurer, knowing that Judas was a thief and stealing the money. That way Jesus doesn't have the money, so he doesn't have to worry about it. It's not a temptation for him when he doesn't have it. A lot of times, like when it comes to food, if someone's on a diet and they say, well, I'm not going to eat any chocolate, probably one of the first things they do is they get all chocolate out of the house. Because then, they're not, if they get a craving for chocolate and want to eat it, well, it's not there in the house, it's not readily available, so then they won't succumb to that temptation. So too, Jesus says, well, Judas, you take the money. That way it's not a temptation to him. And that's what Paul is saying too. He says, I got a right to get money from you, because even the ox gets food from the people from the one he serves. So I have the right to get money from them. But I don't want to abuse my power in the gospel and create a love of money. And I want to make the gospel of Christ without charge so that others may be saved. And so it's just a great thing to see, and it shows that that's what we should do. Especially when you have people who have devoted their lives, pastors and people who are preaching, they should not be taking money from people. Look at what damage the televangelists have done to churchianity. People will not, or Christianity, I should say, because first off, they have erred from the faith, so they don't preach a pure gospel. Joel Osteen has the biggest church, I believe, in America, Christian church. He'll say, well, I preach Jesus, but, the Hindus, they've got their own way to God, and the Buddhists have their own way to God. Now, I can't judge them. Well, yes, you can, because 1 Corinthians 2:15 says, he that is spiritual judgeth all things, yet he himself is judged of no man. And so when you know the truth, you can judge what's false. When if I take a test and it's a true or false thing, questions, I can judge if something is true or false if I know the material. So it's the same thing. You can judge whether a religion or what a religion or people are saying is true or false if you know the truth. If you know the truth, you can say, oh, that statement is true or that statement is false. But here's Joel Osteen saying, well, I can't judge those other religions. If they have their way to God, that's fine for them. That shows he's not preaching the truth. Well, because the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. So in an attempt to get rich, which he has become rich, then he errs from the faith by saying that Jesus is not the only way to heaven. It's very easy then to get away from that. So when people are looking for the truth, when they recognize, I'm a sinner, I need to get right with God, they turn on the televangelist and he's not preaching a clear gospel. He's preaching a false gospel, or else if he preached a clear gospel, the people that had money wouldn't put him on the program. Satan is the god of this world. He has people operating by the course of this world. So if I'm going against his course by preaching the truth, then the people who follow Satan are not going to promote me. And so people aren't going to hear that. The only thing people are going to hear when it comes to what's on television or in the media, what's popular, is going to be what's promoted by the Satan, the god of this world. And so it's going to end up being lies. And so that's why they've erred from the faith, in order to serve mammon, serve money. And even if they did preach a clear gospel, which is very rare to hear from any of these preachers, but if they did slip up and preach that you receive atonement for your sin by trusting in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection alone, even if they preach that, how many people are going to believe it? Because here they are looking for the truth. They recognize they're sinners and they're looking to get right with God. Am I really going to listen to somebody who has an Armani suit on that makes millions of dollars when I'm just some poor guy? Is that really the person who knows the truth? Wouldn't it be someone like Jesus who didn't have much money? Isn't the motto, what would Jesus do? I don't think Jesus would live in $1 million mansion. According to the Bible, I don't think he would. At least not on this earth, at least not in this world. In his Father's kingdom he would, but not in this world. So then why would I listen to that person? So, and again, a lot of times, especially when it comes to right division and you follow the truth, there isn't much money in that. So even if you take, a salary to support your family, no one can blame you for that. But as Christians, the more we have sound doctrine in the inner man or Bible believers, the choices that we make are not between good and bad. The choices are between good, better, and best, usually. Because we know what's wrong, what we shouldn't do. And also we know that all things are lawful unto us in the dispensation of grace, and so we can do whatever we want. But our goal should be, we are ambassadors of Christ to reconcile people to God. And so our goal should be to do that, reconcile people to God. And Paul is saying here, I'm sure he wouldn't get much money from these churches. And he says, even that, he says, my goal is that I may make the gospel of Christ without charge. He doesn't want to get any money from these churches. He'd rather have some sleepless nights working as a tent maker and selling those tents on the side to support himself than to get a good night's sleep and have the churches support him. Because another facet of that is it's very easy to abuse your power in the gospel, as if a church is, or people are supporting you, then they won't like what you say sometimes when you teach the truth. They may like a lot of the stuff you say, but then something will go against what they want to believe. Everybody hangs on to some false doctrine to some extent. And so they may say, I don't like what he said. So they say, hey, I want you to stop teaching that. I want you to stop teaching that water baptism is not for today, because you're driving people away. No one else teaches that. And you say, but it's the truth. I know Romans 6 and 1 Corinthians 12 and Colossians 2 and Galatians. I know these chapters, and it makes it clear that 1 Corinthians 1, that it's a dry baptism for today by the Spirit into Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. It's not a water baptism. But then the person will say, I give a lot of money, I sacrifice to support your ministry. I really want you to stop teaching water baptism is not for today. So, next thing you know, if people are supporting you monetarily, then they can control you. And that's how people err from the faith. It's really, especially once you start accepting money and you're supported by people, it's really hard to get off of that. That's why the Democrats in the United States push a welfare state, because they know if they can get the majority of the country on welfare, then they're going to be voted in and retain power all the time. Because the people that are on welfare are getting checks, getting money, they want to keep getting the free money. So then they'll keep voting them in. Once you're dependent on someone else, it's hard to become independent again. And so Paul says, I don't want that. I want to make sure I'm going to present the gospel of Christ without charge, because I am a servant of Christ. A dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. And so I am going to preach that gospel, and I'm going to give sound doctrine, mystery doctrine for this dispensation. And I don't want to be restrained or constrained by people who are supporting me. And so I mention all this because churchianity, that's all you see. You see all this false doctrine out there by all these different preachers, and you see that they're all supported by their organizations. That's not a coincidence. If they would just get away from that support and support their own selves, then they could preach the truth and not follow after money, but follow after the truth, be an ambassador for Christ. And then, if they come across something in Scripture that they know most people wouldn't agree with, that they would get upset with, you don't care, you go ahead and preach it. Look at Jesus. He had 5,000 people in John 6 that were around him. He gave them the truth, and all left him but the 12 at that time. Jesus, obviously he wanted people to believe him, but he didn't care about the money. And so he says, I don't care if you leave me or not. I don't care if you stop supporting me. I'm going to preach the truth. People leave, so what? That's an attitude you can have only if you don't love money, only if you're not supported by someone else. And so that's what Paul does. He says, I make the gospel of Christ without charge, that I abuse not my power in the gospel. Because the dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. And I don't want to get away from the pure gospel and the mystery doctrine for today by compromising, by taking money. And Paul, being our pattern, shows that's what we should follow today. That we should also not be supported by people monetarily, but we should follow the truth and be sure to preach the truth, the gospel and the mystery doctrine for this dispensation, and not take money so that we are not constrained by others' desires on what we preach. And so then we err from the faith and pierce ourselves through with many sorrows. Thanks for watching.